Back then, you didn't have cell phones, you didn't have the internet. You had no way of knowing what was going on anywhere else. And on Saturday nights, I had to know who won Stafford. I had to know who won Riverside. I didn't want to wait for Speedway Scene to come out on Thursday.
You could get the results from Plainville Stadium, Riverside Park. You just call Paul Tremaine, Checkered Flag Announcer, and he would have the list of everybody that finished up front.
You didn't have the push-button phones either. You had the old rotary dials. So you'd dial in this number over and over and over and over again.
Welcome to Checkered Flag Announcer. Your comments invited at Box 114, Willimantic, Connecticut. This report to run till approximately 10 o'clock Tuesday night.
Paul Tremaine was a great man, and he did a great service for race fans.
And back then, there wasn't really news coverage that we would say that we have today or even many years ago.
That's it for tonight's edition of Checkered Flag.
On Radio WILI in Willimantic, Connecticut.
Be sure to be with us tomorrow night when we move our attention to the New London Waterford Speedbowl.
When I worked at Stafford, I would stop on Friday afternoon early. I'd go early and I'd stop in Willimantic and stop and say hello to Paul.
I remember beeping the horn on the way to Stafford if Paul hadn't left yet at the little corporate oil company of Willimantic. You know, hey, come on, you know, let's get to the racetrack. You know, leave work already.
Paul would sit there and he'd do his little tape and he'd talk about the race sometimes.
Right now the cars are forming through the first and second turn. Working along with us tonight will be our old buddy Andrew Main. And here we go now. As the green flag flies, and it's Dick Castle moving into the lead after the green flag flies, moving ahead of Nick Champlin. So Castle and Champlin hitting the brakes, gets everything screwed up out there. And here's the 5 being hit by the 318 of John Runnels, the 09 being hit by the 15 and driving into the rear of the number 21 of Dick Watson. So it's going to be a considerable amount of mechanical damage out there, as well as plenty of hurt feelings, because it looks as though some of that could have been avoided. The 9 of Mike Beebe standing there, sitting there more or less on its side. Dick Watson out of the car, moving over to survey the damage, and a little bit of discussion going on there between the drivers.
Yeah, matter of fact, when I wasn't in between cars or when racing, I used to stand on the platform in the middle of the Speedbowl, and we'd do interviews. He would interview me during the races and stuff, you know, like.
So, Mark, how does it look to you?
It looks very competitive. I think Potter has the best shot of anybody. He was really turning. I had him in the heat, his lap as low as 16.3. And the closest competitor, I think, to him, it would be Dunn, who was about in the 16.8 range in his heat. So I think Potter has the best shot of anybody, and his car is capable of running long races. It's more of a long-distance machine than a short tracker.
Yeah, the Checkered Flag Announcer started, as I remember, just with 1 or 2 lines that were Willimantic numbers.
And he had, if I remember right, I think it was 3 different numbers.
I must be nerdy enough that if I tried real hard, I could probably remember them. I think it was like 0026 and 0027.
I remember an 0025 and an 0026.
Welcome to Checkered Flag Announcer. On the phone lines continuously since July the 12th, 1972.
That was fun. Especially to find out results from other tracks or whatever, who did what, where. You know, I used to call every night around midnight.
I know you could just call up and find out what was going on in racing anywhere.
My father would throw a dime or a quarter or whatever to Kenny and say, hey, see what's going on, you know? And he would go to a payphone and call, and then of course you'd have to call and call and call. It's not like today with the calling stuff, you had to call and call.
At Thompson on Sunday afternoon, it was George Murray once again making a sweep as he won the LMS and the Volkswagen division. And now back to the big one at Martinsville.
And he'd come back and it was always the guessing game. Oh, you're not going to believe what happened at Wall, and da-da-da-da, you know. And it was so exciting. It was so exciting. You know, it was, I miss it. I really miss it.
It was really neat. You call in this number and then all of a sudden Paul gets talking and he tells everything that happened all around the racing, all of New England.
He would have a whole rundown of all the tracks in the area, who won, who was second, and he'd have little commentaries about this guy, interviews of drivers and interviews of winners. It was neat.
Today on this, the 0027 line, we talked to Richie Evans, former NASCAR National Modified Champion from Rome, New York.
Richie, I was wondering, do you intend to remain in the modified division, or do you have aspirations? Of course, I imagine most drivers have aspirations to move up.
I'm pretty happy with what I'm doing, you know. At least I can make a living at it and enjoy it, and enjoy the people.
If it wasn't for Paul Tremaine, I can remember week after week going to Thompson Speedway on a Sunday and asking people who were at different tracks who won last night. You know, if you saw Richie Evans there, how'd you do at Shangri-La last night? If you saw the Good Roads there, who won Waterford last night? Who won Riverside? Who won Seekonk? Who won Westboro? But with Paul, late at night, you know, as soon as you got home, because again, you couldn't do it on the way home. Nobody had a cell phone. Nobody heard of a cell phone. But I'd get home and just, you know, start calling and calling and calling.
You know, trying to do it quietly because your parents are downstairs. You don't want them to know you're awake, much less making a toll call on telephone.
I really remember, like, just dying to know if you were at, you know, especially if something big had happened before. If you were at Stafford on a Friday night, but you knew that at Monadnock maybe Punky Karen and Ollie Silva had banged wheels or something. Man, I wonder what happened there. I wonder if they did it again. I mean, you couldn't wait. You had no way to know. You know, you couldn't call anybody that raced there because they didn't have a phone. By the time they got home, it was 2 in the morning.
When we come home from the Speedbowl at night, we'd get home, we'd call Checkered Flag. A lot of times Paul would be still there doing a tape. He'd talk to you, tell you what happened at this track, at that track. That's the only way you could really get results.
My dad used to run weekly at Riverside Park, so he'd go be at Riverside, but my uncle would be off running somewhere else. He'd call the Checkered Flag report to see if he had the finish from whoever the tour was running.
The biggest thing I remember about that was that white Gremlin. I think it had a number 26 on the door.
What I remember most about Paul Tremaine's Checkered Flag Announcer was the Gremlin. That he had American Motors Gremlin.
Well, he had a little Gremlin. It was white and purple, if I remember correctly.
You'd see it at like fast food restaurants. You'd see it at, you know, other racetracks, and it was always in the infield.
You know, you remember the Gremlin he drove around in, and full of stuff. And he would get all this information and he would relay it to the people that really want to hear it.
It was a great service. Paul was a servant to the racing community for many, many years. It was a really thankless job. I don't know if anyone ever helped him out or not.
You know, one of the names that gets lost with Paul Tremaine is Joe Gullis.
Joe Gullis was kind of his right-hand man for years.
A lot of people don't associate Joe with Paul, but Joe had an awful lot to do with that too. Joe did an awful lot of work for Checkered Flag Announcer.
In those days, it was difficult. Nobody had fax machines, nobody had computers, nobody texted. You used to have to call each individual racetrack, and especially if the local guys were racing somewhere else other than around here, he would call that racetrack, like such as Martinsville or Trenton or whatever, and try to get as much finishing information as he could. He would write it down, and he had a book that was many, many pages long, and he would do it longhand. Every track, whether it be Islip or Riverside Park, Waterford, you name the track that was racing, and that night he had a page and he had the top 3, 4, 5, whatever he could gather.
You know, a lot of times Paul had a number that people would call and you would record your own report. If you were a slick guy like Janicitis or like Joe Gullis.
First thing I did when I got out of the racetrack, pick up the phone, call Paul. Here's the results, here's the rundown. I'll give you a report later, but right now you got the finishes. I
would do reports for Paul remotely from where we were. Like if I was in Richmond, you know, working there, I'd report from Richmond, or Stafford, obviously I was there. I'd sneak away, you know, call him on his private number. He'd turn the tape on and you know, give him a report from the race.
Other tracks would just call Paul and give him the top 5, and then he'd make his own little report out of it.
And then later, as it quieted down, he'd start putting it on a tape. In this case, the answering machines, which weren't intended for that, but they worked pretty good.
I remember going to his house a couple of times, and the first time I walked in, I think it was in his basement. But the only thing I remember is I never saw that much wire in my life. You know, just different tape machines, and I didn't understand any of it. I thought it was just the most incredible thing I'd ever seen.
And he would sit there by the phone for hours, days. 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning was nothing for him to pick up live.
And every once in a while, you'd get Paul live. If you called between 12 and 1, you would get Paul live.
Every once in a while you'd call, he would just pick up the phone and start rattling off what he was going to record. Like if you caught it too soon, you get the live report.
And he'd be working on tape in the background while he told you what happened at whatever racetrack you wanted to know about.
I called him so often on Saturday nights that he finally gave me his personal phone number because the other lines would be busy, and we always wanted to know how Richie did, you know, and that was, he would have that information.
And when we would come back from the races, his wife would always have what she used to call her buffet on the table, because they used to do a lot of gardening. And fresh tomatoes and cucumbers, and at 2 o'clock in the morning having a BLT and shooting over the bull that happened that night or whatever, or the night before or the night after, or what we're going to do the next day.
And one time we were up at the Thompson 300 and he was parked on the infield, and we weren't racing that year, and I was just kind of walking around out there, so he asked me to come over and help him. So I had to sit on his car and keep track of who was leading and how many laps. I had to write it all down, but I felt pretty honored to do that for him.
When we first started building race cars for sale, Dick Barney was actually the first customer. And we built a new car for him, and the very first night he won, and that's how we found out. It's on Checkered Flag.
I remember Val Lasser, who used to own New England Speedway Scene, which became Speedway Scene. He would always tell Paul that he should tinker with the idea of making that a 900 number, where you would get, you know, you'd get some small collection for it, and people would have done it. I mean, you would have given anything to find out some nights, you know, if you were at Riverside, who won Waterford or vice versa. You know, you just wanted to know. If it cost a couple bucks, you wouldn't have cared.
And the sad thing was they'd have raffles and you know, stuff, but you would have thought more people that were able to afford to help him would have helped him, you know, to keep it going. I think he needed $1,100 to $1,200 a month to keep that thing going.
And one time, myself and another girl that went to the Speedbowl, B. Smith, we did a collection for him, trying to come up with some money to help him keep going. And we gave him a little trophy one night at the Speedbowl and gave him the money. He was just very, very good.
It was kind of like what you'd look at on a message board or on Facebook. Now
It's like the internet of the 80s. It was phenomenal.
Man, we're dating ourselves here, huh?
He was a wonderful person. He really was. I was so happy when he went into the Hall of Fame, and we were there that year, and I walked over and he looked a little funny at me, and I says, Peg, and oh gosh, and he was so happy to see us. And so I was glad that he was honored.
I remember when Paul got inducted into the Near Hall of Fame, I think Joe brought him there that day. They had his gremlin outside, you know.
There's something to be said too, by the way, about anybody who chases the races as much as someone like Paul did. I mean, I think you're really sort of serving the community in a sense when you're doing that. It really takes a commitment, and I mean, I think sometimes people underestimate the commitment it takes to do some of this stuff. And it's interesting too, because you'll see people come and go out of the industry, and then there's others who are in it for a long term. That's a tough road to hoe, I think, sometimes.
I mean, Paul Tremaine he performed an incredible service and was, you know, one of the real colorful people in racing in that period.
I always admired that. He really stuck to it. I think it was very professional what he tried to do and keep things very local. And I thought he did a wonderful job, you know, with that, keeping the racing community informed. If you had to miss a week or something, you always just call it up and you get all the details, the results, and you know, the highlights and things like that.
Today, everybody knows everything within 5 minutes. You know, you're not even to your car in the parking lot at Waterford yet. You probably know who won at 2 or 3 other racetracks. You know?
Back in that day, that was, you know, ahead of his time. You know, really neat.
There were certain things that stand out from the era, and that was definitely one of them. Paul was a great guy.
Great man. He was so dedicated to the sport, and both he and Joe Golis did wonders, you know, to keep us all informed.
Fantastic person. He was a real pioneer.
I mean, you talk about people that really gave a lot of time and effort to racing. That was a guy, and he was a great man. You know, I always thought the world of him.
Well, that's the checkered flag for us. This is Paul Tremaine. Thanks for calling in. Please drive safely.